If we have a war in space in the vicinity of the Earth, it will be the one and only. There will never be a second war in space. And let me tell you why. It only takes a simple calculation to determine this, and all aerospace engineers know what it is. It's been studied many times. You do not need but a few million pounds of matter in space, broken up into tiny pellets, 1 gram size, to make the near regions of space totally uninhabitable from the debris. Space is the most environmentally sensitive area we have around Earth. On the oceans, a beer can sink to the bottom, be covered over with silt, and in a few generations will return to the Earth. It'll disintegrate. A piece of space junk, if it's in an orbit that doesn't intersect the atmosphere, will stay there forever. There is no way to clean it up. We explode a few pieces of equipment up there. 8 million pounds, that is the size of one Saturn Apollo launch vehicle, what I went to the moon on. You break up 8 million pounds into 1 gram mass and let it distribute throughout the first 1,000 kilometers of space. And no spacecraft can survive in space more than a few days. Future generations will be precluded from using space at all. And being able to get out to deep space, it will be like swimming through a piranha-filled river or running through a hail of bullets to get into outer space. It doesn't seem sensible to me that in the first 100 years of using that environment, presumably for our betterment, we take decisions and commit acts that preclude all future generations from a proper use of that environment.
Come to find out today, there are over 110,000 pieces of space junk orbiting the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour. So many that they recently had to move the International Space Station to another orbit to get out of the way of the coming space junk. The space station that originally was going to cost taxpayers $10 billion, and now today is now costing us $100 billion, could have been smashed to bits by this space junk. But also we know today that there are 34 nuclear reactor cores orbiting the Earth below, launched there by the United States and the former Soviet Union, all the way back to the early 60s when the space program began. These nuclear reactor cores are powering military satellites orbiting the planet. But several of them have fallen back to Earth, including a terrible accident in 1964 of a U.S. military satellite with 2 pounds of plutonium on board. It was called SNAP 9A. It burned up on re-entry, spreading the plutonium globally to be ingested by the people of the Earth into our lungs and to be passed on through our reproductive organs for generations after generations to come. One of the founders of uranium, Dr. John Goffman at Lawrence Livermore Labs in California, studied that particular accident and believes it's one of the major contributors to the increased cancers around the Earth today. And now the Bush administration is contemplating a dramatic escalation of the launching of nuclear materials into space. Mars missions with little rovers driving around, powered by plutonium-238. Nuclear rockets and nuclear-powered mining colonies on the Moon and Mars and other planetary bodies. And what about the laboratories at the Department of Energy labs across the country as they're fabricating these plutonium devices? Will we see a growing contamination at these laboratories and amongst the workers? Well, the answer is absolutely yes. And in fact, in 1997, when Cassini was launched, and our organization organized a global campaign against the launching of 72 pounds of plutonium-238 on board the Cassini spaceflight, we found out that between 94 and 96 at Lawrence Livermore Labs in New Mexico, there were 244 cases of worker contamination reported as they were fabricating the generators for the Cassini mission. So it's not just some theoretical possibility that there might be an accident on launch that could cause contamination. The sheer processing and fabrication of these space devices is killing people already. But if we learned anything from the Challenger and Columbia shuttle accidents, it's that space technology can and does fail. And as we all witnessed on television, that wide debris field as the Columbia burned up on re-entry, this should be a warning to us that launching nuclear power in space could contaminate massive, massive parts of this country or another country on this earth.
The chances of something going wrong just by accident are quite high. I mean, these are complicated computerized systems. Others aren't going to just sit around. So, for example, offensive weaponry from space, which is being planned, requires satellites. Space rather heavily on satellite communication. Well, you know, shooting down satellites isn't very hard. It's a lot easier than stopping missiles. I mean, you know where the satellite is, and you know where it's going, and so on. So anti-satellite weapons are kind of a poor man's weapon. And there's very little doubt that potential targets like China will be developing technology. We're asking them virtually to develop technology to destroy our satellite system. So far that's been immune because of the observance of the space treaty. And then there's going to be other reactions. I mean, they're going to increase their development of weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent, probably increase terror as a deterrent, because there aren't a lot of alternatives. And once you get up to, the Russians are already responding with, under U.S. pressure, incidentally, to move, to expand radically their offensive nuclear weapon system, to put it on launch on warning, which is extremely dangerous. They're deteriorating economy during the so-called reforms. The computerized systems are falling apart. We've come very close to accidental nuclear war, and this substantially increases the risk, and sooner or later it'll happen, just by what's called in the trade normal accidents, meaning the kind of accident that you know is going to take place in any complex system, but you don't know when. You know, so any complex, say a computer or any, these are way more complex systems, something's going to go wrong, because it always does. And if it happens to go wrong, you know, say goodbye to each other.
In the environmental impact statement for the Cassini mission carrying 72 pounds of plutonium, NASA admitted that if there was a launch explosion and there was a release of the plutonium, that the winds would carry it for about a 60-mile radius, all the way from the Space Center out to Orlando on the west, north to Daytona Beach, and south to Vero Beach, Florida. A 60-mile contamination belt, if you will. And NASA said that they would have to go in and remove all the people. Then they would have to go in and remove all the buildings. Then they'd have to go in and remove all the animals. Can you imagine how they would do that? The fish, the birds, the snakes, the alligators. Then they would have to remove all the vegetation and ultimately remove the top half-inch of soil, because everything would be radioactively contaminated for thousands of years. They would have essentially created a nuclear wasteland.
A couple of years ago, NASA had a launch accident at the Cape, the Delta rocket. The toxic material from that was in my community within an hour or so, and no one knew what was happening, only that there was breathing problems in the air. When I called emergency management of my local county office, there was no information. That emergency management office had no information about what was on that rocket, whether there was nuclear material released, and there was absolutely no time, there was no warning, no one had any time, and people were getting respiratory problems from this cloud that was hovering over our town. They have absolutely no plans to protect us from any kind of nuclear explosion at the Cape, and I'm very, very concerned for my community.
And so that's why this nuclear systems initiative of the Bush administration is so dangerous, because they're now contemplating a dramatic expansion dramatic escalation of the numbers of launches. It's like playing Russian roulette, putting a bullet in the chamber and pulling the trigger. Eventually, one of them is going to go off.